You may recall from previous videos an insight that I've been pushing, which is that whenever a conservative defeats a liberal for a major national office in Britain or the United States, the Liberal Party, the Left Party, goes crazy and nominates unelectable people for a decade before it returns to its senses. That's exactly what's happening right now with the Democratic Party. When you look at the results in Florida, where they nominated Andrew Gillum for governor, the mayor of Tallahassee, who is immersed in a scandal. He's been under investigation by the FBI, and he's calling for a $15 minimum wage for single-payer health care. He wants to abolish ICE, and he narrowly won the Democratic primary. 34% of the vote. His rival, who was sane, got 31%. He's never going to be elected governor of Florida. Ron DeSantis as much as won that election the day the Democrats had their primaries. And then same thing in Michigan, where Gretchen Whitmer is the Democratic candidate for governor, and her lieutenant governor candidate is Garland Gilchrist. Gilchrist has supported Hamas, and in 2009 said, "I'm sick of politicians and evangelicals kissing Israel's ass," unquote, pardon the language, but that's his quote. And Whitmer refuses to condemn the BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction policy against Israel. She narrowly edged out a Muslim candidate for the Democratic nomination. So her candidacy isn't going anywhere either. Schuette, the Republican, will win in Michigan precisely because the Democrats have nominated someone who can't get elected. And then we have the same thing in Queens. Here, of course, the Democrat will be elected, but it's emblematic of the drift to the left when Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez defeated Joe Crowley, the longtime Democratic congressman. And she's become sort of the poster girl for the progressive movement in this country. The historical precedent of this is clear, and pardon me for repeating it. But in 1980, when Reagan defeated Carter, the left went berserk. And instead of moving to the center and trying to win elections, they nominated Walter Mondale and Mike Dukakis, who lost by overwhelming margins, until in 1992 they recovered their sanity, nominated Bill Clinton, and were able to win. The same thing happened in Britain when Margaret Thatcher defeated James Callaghan for Prime Minister. The Labour Party nominated Neil Kinnock and Michael Foot in the successive elections after Callaghan, and lost by massive margins before they became sane and nominated Tony Blair, and the Labour Party won once more. The reason this happens is that the moderates, the independents, the sane people, leave the left-wing party and either go independent or enter the Conservative Party. And that means the primary election process in the left-wing party is so distorted that only liberals and leftists can win. Only people who are unelectable by the rest of the country. So the Democrats are euphoric now about the new progressive revolution and all of that. But it's all based on nominating candidates who can't get elected. Thanks for watching. Very, very good economic news coming, and buried, ignored by the mainstream media. The Democrats are yelling, yeah, the economy is doing better, but wage stagnation, wages aren't going up. Well, that is a total myth. Just recently, but it is now officially a myth. Median household income, which adjusted for inflation, which is really the best way to measure incomes, was at $59,000 in 1999. Then it fell to $53,000 by 2012. Year after year, it kept dropping. Then in 2012, it began to move up again, and in 2017, rebounded to 59,000. So it was a gigantic V from 59 down to 53, back up to 59. But in the 8 months of this year, since the Trump tax cut was signed into law, incomes have soared The monthly data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics indicates that real adjusted for inflation median household income has risen from $59,000 in January to $62,000 now, the pace of $3,000 increase over 8 months. And if that continues, it's going to completely transform the nature of incomes in the United States. And the Democrats will no longer be able to inveigh against wage stagnation. Now, how can they continue to talk about it in light of these data? First, the monthly data does not receive the same publicity the quarterly data does, so in a few months it'll catch up. Secondly, the Democrats don't like the concept of median household family income adjusted for inflation because it includes government cash transfer payments like Social Security and other stuff. So they prefer wage levels to measure wage levels. And at that level, there has been more stagnation. But those are a limited number of jobs where people are paid certain wages every week. Do not count government benefits, do not count outside sources of income or outside investments, and don't count other jobs that they may have. So median household income is by far the best way to measure, and is the classical way. And by that measurement, the United States is doing just fine. I think you'll hear a lot less grumbling about wage stagnation in the future. And all of this can date precisely the growth to the Trump tax cut. Thanks for watching. For the last 3 Saturday videos, I've discussed foreign intervention in U.S. elections to show that this is something that's not unusual and certainly not unique if, in fact, Russia did intervene. The first video 3 weeks ago talked about French intervention to try to elect Jefferson during the French Revolution. The second one in 1940, the British intervention to try to get the Republicans to nominate Wendell Willkie, a pro-British candidate, as World War II started. And the last week we talked about the establishment of the left-wing Progressive Party by the Communist Party in 1948 and their nomination of former Vice President Henry Wallace to run against Harry Truman. The fourth example I'd like to talk about today happened in 1960. Nikita Khrushchev, the dictator of the Soviet Union, hated Richard Nixon. Nixon had visited Moscow and had been combative and fierce in his discussions with Khrushchev, gave as good as he got, and Khrushchev considered him closed-minded, a cold warrior, and not someone he could trust to do business with. So after the election of 1960, when Kennedy narrowly defeated Nixon by 0.1%, Khrushchev said that he voted in the election and his vote put Kennedy over. What he meant by that, he explained in his memoirs, Khrushchev remembers, is that in 1959, 58 and 59, the U.S. had a U-2 plane that was shot down, a spy plane, over Russia, and the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, parachuted to safety but into Russian captivity. And Khrushchev was going to release Powers back to the U.S., but would not do so until after the 60 election, so Nixon couldn't claim credit for it. And Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president, and his slogan was, "Experience counts." And his whole point was that he's good at dealing with the Russians, and he's good at standing up to them and getting America's interests protected. But here he couldn't deliver on getting Powers released, and Khrushchev gave Kennedy an easy victory right after he took office of sending Powers back to the United States. There was a movie about that where they meet on the bridge. And that was a clear step that Khrushchev took to influence the U.S. election. In fact, when he met President Kennedy in Vienna 6 months after Kennedy took office, Khrushchev told him that he was instrumental in getting Kennedy elected and basically asked for credit. So it's not unusual for Russia to intervene in U.S. elections. Thanks for watching. With Trump's announcement that he's going to renew and snap back into place oil sanctions and sanctions on banking in Iran, the European Union, which was not consulted and opposed that action, is struggling to try to stop the U.S. sanctions from controlling European conduct. But they're failing. European companies like Total and Siemens and others who have huge business interests in Iran are closing them down and relocating outside of the country because the U.S. sanctions have a secondary sanctions provision which say that not only are U.S. companies not allowed to do business in Iran, but no dollar transactions can take place in Iran or over Iranian trade, and any company that does business with Iran will be foreclosed from accessing the United States market. And with that threat, all major companies in the world that are involved with Iran are pulling out. The European Union hates this because it demonstrates their weakness and their inability to stop this. And they're appeasers anyway, but this becomes more of an institutional question about the European lack of power. So the European Union passed a law blocking U.S. sanctions and forbidding any of its European nationals from abiding by the U.S. sanctions and offering to reimburse anyone who was damaged by these sanctions for the cost of their loss of income. And no companies are taking them up on it. Companies are saying, hey, we are not going to lose the U.S. market, and they're ignoring the EU blocking statute. That's an incredible development. The other big area of battle is over SWIFT, SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide International Financial Transactions. I got that, SWIFT. That's the clearinghouse, that basically the switchboard that connects financial institutions and customers throughout the world to send financial messages. They transmit 15 million messages a day, only 2 million back in 1995, and involve 200 countries and 11,000 financial institutions. SWIFT is nominally owned by a Belgian consortium, but Citibank and JP Morgan both sit on its board. And SWIFT is no longer accepting anything from Iran once the sanctions were imposed in early November, because they can't do dollar-denominated transactions without running afoul of the U.S. sanctions. The Germans have proposed replacing SWIFT with a European alternative, but none of the European banks or companies is willing to go along with that. There was some hope that Russia and China and India might fill the breach, but Russia is worried about another round of sanctions. China's banking system is tottering anyway in the middle of its economic doldrums, and India has already announced compliance with the sanctions. The other fear has been that oil prices would rise because of the sanctions, but last time the sanctions were imposed in 2011, oil prices actually dropped, and Saudi Arabia said they will increase production by up to 2 million barrels a day to mitigate the impact of the loss of Iranian oil. So the point is that the U.S. is acting unilaterally, toughly, strongly, and effectively against Iran, and there's not a damn thing Europe can do about it. Thanks for watching. The Inspector General's office has released an outrageous finding that there was a Chinese state-owned company that inserted code into Hillary's private email server at the State Department, the result of which was that every time she sent or received an email, the verbatim texts of those emails ended up with Chinese intelligence in Beijing. So they had a complete window on every piece of information that flowed in or out of the American Secretary of State's office. The Inspector General's office was so concerned about this. In 2015, a year before the election, that they walked it over to the FBI and handed it to Peter Strzok, the agent who was put in charge of investigating Hillary's emails and is the one who was fired because of his anti-Trump texts. And Strzok did absolutely nothing about it. Nothing surfaced. There was no change in Hillary's server. There were no protective steps taken. When Strzok testified before the House Oversight Committee, Congressman Louis Gohmert of Texas, disclosure, a former client, questioned him closely on whether he had any evidence of foreign penetration of Hillary's email server. And he said, yes, there was some indication that a foreign actor may have penetrated the server. And the media didn't cover it because Gohmert went on to questions about Strzok's adultery, and that was with Lisa Page, and that was so much more interesting to cover. But this information now has come out and cast new relevance to Gohmert's question and to Strzok's answer. This is a gigantic scandal and really should lay the basis for reopening the email investigation and going after Hillary on it. There also is increasing evidence that when Anthony Weiner, Huma Abedin's husband's computer was seized by the FBI and a trove of new Hillary emails was discovered there, which had been parked there by Huma and Hillary so that they didn't have to be disclosed, that the FBI did not fully review those emails. They said they did, and there was a one-week period when they said, oh, we're reviewing them all, a week before the election, and then a hurried, breathless statement 3 or 4 days before the election that there were no classified materials there. But it now turns out that they reviewed only about a third or a quarter of the emails, and the rest have never been reviewed. And finally, we have the fact that the people in charge of the Hillary email investigations have all now been fired, removed, or demoted. And the Justice Department has got to reopen this investigation in light of the Chinese information, the Weiner information, and the sloppiness of the original investigation. Thanks for watching. In the last few days, Donald Trump has moved decisively and wonderfully to totally undercut the power of the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinians in Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. The first thing he did was to pull $200 million of American aid so that we are no longer supporting these horrible people. One of the reasons he was able to do that was the Taylor Force Act that Congress passed that said that if the Palestinian Authority uses its money to subsidize and give pensions to the families of dead suicide bombers, that the United States will withhold its funding of the Palestinian Authority. They have continued it, and we are now withholding it. Thank goodness. That, by the way, will be a big blow to them. That's about a quarter of their total revenues over the course of the year. But the second step is perhaps even more important. He's moving to end this ridiculous fiction that these people are refugees, displaced persons. In any other situation where you have refugees, after 2 or 3 or 5 years, they are repatriated to their home or scattered to other countries throughout the world, and partially depending on what they want. But in this case, they have chosen to stay together in refugee camps, not move anyplace, add to their number as they have children, and claim this right of return, the right to return to Israel. Now, the fact is that the overwhelming majority of them left of their own accord when war broke out after Israel was denounced by the United Nations as being a nation. And there was war, the Arabs attacked Israel, and Israel defended itself and defeated them. And in the war, a lot of these refugees decided to leave, partially because they were afraid of what would happen in a Jewish state, and partially because people run away when there's a war because they're worried about getting killed. But instead of coming back after it was over, they chose to stay outside, first in Jordan and then on the West Bank in Gaza. And that was their choice. It was not something that Israel forced upon them. And let's end this fiction that these are people just hanging around the bus stop waiting to be brought back to their native land. Trump is explicitly saying the United States now rejects the right of return, which is the core demand of the Palestinians, that they should be allowed back into Israel to take over the country, after Israel has moved it from a desert country to a booming international power with high tech and other industries that are the envy of the world. Now it should go back to the Bedouins, who make it into an agrarian society at best. This is insane, and Trump is now saying that's not our policy, that's not what we're going to do. We do not recognize the right of return. And he's called on the United Nations to reevaluate the refugee status of the Palestinians. And if he does that, if he succeeds at that, there will be no UN aid forthcoming for these Palestinians, because they would not be regarded any longer as refugees. Now, most countries are not going to go along with Trump, but Trump is laying the basis for a unilateral U.S. withdrawal from the refugee program, which would absolutely destroy it financially, and with it destroy the financial basis of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. Couldn't happen to nicer people. Thank goodness for President Trump. Thanks for watching. As part of the establishment's celebration of the crashing and burning of Donald Trump last week, which, by the way, didn't happen. If you look at my video yesterday, Trump actually moved up 2 points. Has been a legal argument that Trump really violated campaign finance law and committed something that could be tantamount to high crimes and misdemeanors, the basis for impeachment in our Constitution. Well, Andrew McCarthy, a former U.S. attorney, or assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District and a columnist for the National Review, spelled out the argument against this, and it's worth paying attention to him. He begins by quoting Chairman Bradley Smith, the former head of the Federal Elections Commission, the body charged with implementing campaign finance law. And he says that, quote, despite his guilty plea, Cohen did not violate the campaign finance laws. The idea is that paying hush money is not an in-kind contribution, even though the concealment of embarrassing conduct may have been intended, at least in part, to influence an election. Smith explains that paying for silence is more in the nature of a personal use expenditure, which he defines as an obligation or expense that would exist even if the person for whom it was paid were not a candidate in a political election. And McCarthy goes on to explain that Trump may well have been thinking about the impact on his election chances that the disclosure of the affairs would have, but Trump had major concerns that had nothing to do with the election: personal embarrassment, humiliation of his family, the blow to his marriage. And then McCarthy goes on to discuss a case, the case of John Edwards, where Edwards was accused of something very similar to what Trump is accused of doing. He took money from a donor, Bunny Mellon, and used that to pay for silence for Rael Hunter, his mistress and the mother of his out-of-wedlock child. And the feds brought charges against him for violating campaign finance laws. And his attorney argued back, Abby Lowell, argued back that this was not a campaign expenditure. He was doing this to save his marriage, to prevent harm and pain to his wife, to not besmirch his public image, and had nothing to do, only partially something to do, with the narrow construct of influencing the vote in the election of 2008. And based on this, McCarthy concludes Donald Trump will not face criminal campaign finance charges. The president will not be charged because prosecutors cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he had the required intent to violate the law. And then McCarthy goes on to explain. Federal elections law requires a candidate to knowingly and willfully commit a violation. Willfulness is the law's most burdensome mens rea standard for prosecutors. They have to prove that A, he understood that his conduct was illegal, and B, that he acted with the purpose of disobeying the law. And McCarthy, a former prosecutor, concludes, I do not see how the government could meet this demanding burden of proof. Part of the reason for that is that nobody really knows what the election law is about this kind of stuff. The line between personal use and campaign expenditures has never been precisely defined. And what the candidate is allowed to do as opposed to a member of his staff has also been fudged and not clearly delineated. And in view of that, in view of the vagueness of this, McCarthy says the prosecution cannot meet this burden of proof. So let's get past all of this, folks, okay? He's not going to jail, he's not going to be impeached, and his poll numbers are fine. Okay? Thanks. In today's history video, I'd like to discuss the third example of foreign meddling in U.S. elections. First example 2 weeks ago was 1796, when the French intervened to try to elect Thomas Jefferson. And the next was 1940, when the British intervened to try to elect and nominate Wendell Willkie. In 1948, Russia took its turn. And the Communist Party in the United States, which was very active and very strong, got together and sponsored a presidential candidate, Henry Wallace, in the 48 election, literally formed a new party called the Progressive Party and nominated Wallace as its candidate for president. Wallace was quite a catch for them. He had been FDR's vice president in his third term and only narrowly missed becoming president when they dumped him for when the party dumped him for Harry Truman, and Roosevelt died a month into his fourth term. Wallace had been increasingly critical of Harry Truman for fighting the Cold War. He felt that we should continue to work with Russia in the wartime alliance, and that Russia was simply trying to assure its own security by, in effect, making the Eastern European nations colonies. And increasingly, Wallace moved further to the left, and the Communist Party, on direction from Moscow, infiltrated his organization, his campaign, his life, and really made him, in effect, their candidate. This was a mortal threat to Truman, because he had already faced a tough Republican opponent in Thomas E. Dewey, and the southern wing of the Democratic Party had walked out and nominated Strom Thurmond for president. And now, when he was losing the progressives also, he was involved in a four-way race, with the right and the left deserting his candidacy. And particularly the progressive revolt imperiled his ability to carry New York State, especially since he was running against the governor of New York State, Thomas E. Dewey. Well, in the event, it turned out not to be a problem. Truman won and was elected president, was re-elected president. And the Wallace movement fizzled because it became increasingly clear that he was a Soviet puppet and not his own man. But you can't get more overt in meddling in an election than Russia literally sponsoring and pushing and creating a presidential candidate. Thanks for watching. There's a real bait and switch going on in Congress right now over the crime issue. In the House, a bill passed, which was a fairly moderate, rather good bill, to increase rehabilitation programs for federal inmates, to improve prison conditions, and to do a variety of needed reforms to make our prisons less of a hellhole. But the liberals got a hold of the bill and added all kinds of provisions to strip the system of mandatory sentencing and allow and not permit judges to add on sentences for other crimes, and all kinds of measures that were designed to force judges to impose lighter and lighter sentences. This is a huge departure from what happened in 1986 when the mandatory sentencing bill was passed. It passed 99-0 in the Senate and was co-sponsored by Jesse Helms and Ted Kennedy, a totally unlikely pair. And everybody agreed that judicial discretion had resulted in far too light sentences. And as a result, the number of inmates in federal prisons and state prisons had increased substantially, almost doubling to over 2 million people. Make that over 1 million people. Now it's reversing, and in the last year it's gone down by about 15%, and violent crime has gone up. Sociologists scratch their head and say, why is the crime rate dropping years ago? And the answer was simply we were locking up more people for longer periods. Now that we're locking up fewer people for shorter periods, the crime rate is on its way back up. In fact, it's soaring. And now they're looking at suspending mandatory sentences and giving judges broad discretion to lighten the sentences of accomplices. There's a myth that all these people are convicted of nonviolent drug crimes. In fact, the total number of inmates in prison for nonviolent drug crimes in federal prisons comes to only about 500 inmates. Most of them are there for violent crimes or very serious drug crimes. And they should not have lighter sentences. They should not be released. Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, a wonderful senator, said that he considered this to be a legal jailbreak, and he called on the Senate to stop the House bill and strip it of these liberal amendments. Now Trump has weighed in supporting Cotton's position, and I hope that it prevails. Thanks for watching. Last week, Rasmussen's polling organization asked Americans what they think of capitalism and what they think of socialism. And Democrats gave socialism a 57% positive rating, and capitalism only a 47% positive rating. Well, that really indicates the leftward drift of the Democratic Party. As you may recall, it's been my thesis, and boy, it's proving day after day to be correct, that whenever a conservative defeats a liberal for a major national office, the left party reacts by moving farther and farther and farther to the left. That was true in the U.S. After Reagan defeated Carter. The next two Democratic nominees were Mondale and Dukakis before they got sanity and nominated Clinton. In Britain, the same thing happened. After Thatcher defeated Callaghan, the next three Labour nominees were Callaghan, but then Michael Foot and Neil Kinnock, who moved way, way, way over to the left. They called it the loony Labour left. And the result is that the Liberal Party lost a decade of elections, the Labour Party, until they got sanity and nominated Tony Blair. And that's the cycle the Democratic Party is going through now. They've just nominated a Muslim woman to run. They've just nominated an admittedly bisexual woman to run for Senate in Arizona. This woman who got elected in Queens, who says she's a socialist. These are all crazy left-wing nominees, and the party is moving unrecognizably to the left. That's making many of their congressional candidates unelectable in 2018, and probably will make its presidential nominee unelectable in 2020. The configuration and the substance of the Democratic electorate is moving so far to the left as the moderates drop out because they see what a good job Trump is doing and move to independents or to Republicans, that the primary nominates candidates that the general electorate can't stomach. And I think that's the core dynamic going on right now with this poor benighted former party of mine. Thanks for watching. A year ago, when Eileen and I wrote our book, Rogue Spooks, The Intelligence War on Donald Trump, we predicted virtually everything that's been happening in the last few weeks or months. And now that the emails and texts sent and received by Bruce Orr, the number 4 guy at the Justice Department, have been released publicly, it becomes very clear what was going on and how right those predictions were. We said there was a massive conspiracy involving the FBI, the Justice Department, and the entire intelligence community to perpetrate a hoax that Russia had meddled in the U.S. election in collusion with Donald Trump in an effort to elect Trump. We said that there was a vigorous effort by the government to get the dossier that was prepared that allegedly gave the details of this collusion out in public before the election. We said that after the election, the Justice Department worked hard to try to get this public, and then to make it public, Comey sent it to the president and then made it public from there, and that he was the front person of this entire conspiracy. In effect, we spoke of the web, the spider's web of this conspiracy, but of course we didn't know the name of the spider, and now we do. It's Bruce Orr, who is the number 4 guy at the Justice Department, who's been demoted but not fired. He's still getting paid. And Orr and his wife Nellie, who Trump describes as his beautiful wife Nellie, worked together on this. They're the Bonnie and Clyde, or the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, if you will, of the Russian hoax scandal. Nellie worked full-time for Fusion GPS. She's fluent in Russian, and she worked at concocting the fusion part of this hoax. This all came to light as a result of the releasing of the various texts and emails sent and received by Bruce Orr, who was, as I said, the number 4 guy in the Justice Department. At one point, Orr says that Peter Strzok, Orr says that Christopher Steele, the British former spy who wrote the dossier, was concerned when Comey got fired that their conspiracy would be, quote, exposed, unquote. And Strzok, as you know, characterized this whole Russian meddling scandal as insurance in the event Trump won the election. And it's clear that from the beginning they fabricated this stuff and used it to try to discredit Trump during the election and impeach him after the election. And this trail is entirely visible now in Bruce Orr's emails and text messages. Thank goodness the Congress is going to have Orr before it under oath next week, and we'll ask him questions about it. The key question now is, how high did this conspiracy to fix the 2016 election by phony allegations of collusion, which were funded by the Hillary campaign, taken up by Hillary in the debate, pushed by the Obama administration, and then used afterwards to try to impeach and discredit Donald Trump, how high up did it go? Did Sally Yates, the Deputy Attorney General, know all about it? Did Loretta Lynch, the Attorney General, know all about it? Did Barack Obama, the President, know all about it? And we need to see how high this food chain went, and getting Bruce Orr under oath probably is the first step. Thanks a lot for watching. President Trump has revoked the security clearance of James Brennan, the former director of national intelligence under Obama. Well, why did he have security clearance in the first place after he left office? There are 5,000 Americans who have the highest level of security clearance, and many of them, in fact, most of them, are not currently in office. Hillary Clinton still has her security clearance after she mishandled all this classified data. The reason that everybody is raising hell over the revocation of Brennan's security clearance is not political and it's not legal, it's financial. Having security clearance for these former officials assures access to top-level jobs, some paying in the low 7 figures, because of their access to secret information. And that when that's revoked, their market value is cut way, way back. The real answer is not to restore Brennan's security clearance, but to revoke everybody else's after they leave office. But Brennan is a special case. In 1980, he voted for the Communist Party. He said that Carter wasn't liberal enough for him, and Reagan, of course, not. And he was responsible at the CIA for getting rid of all of the conservatives and hiring an ultra-liberal staff. The way he did that was he announced a sweeping reorganization of the CIA. We explain this in our book, Rogue Spooks, The Intelligence War on Donald Trump. Until he came in, the CIA was organized by function. All of the covert action people, all of the intelligence gathering people, all of the analysis people were grouped together in different bureaus. He replaced that and set up a vertical stratification where every European person was together, all the Russian people, all the Chinese people. And that combined the paper pushers with the real spies, with the covert action types, the cowboys. And they didn't much like it. They resented the loss of status, and it caused wholesale retirements from the agency. And that's just what Brennan intended, because then he had all these vacancies and could fill them with left-leaning types. And that was his heritage, and now these are the same people who are doing all the leaking on Trump. So Obama should never have given Brennan security clearance in the first place, but it certainly is good that Trump revoked it. Thanks for watching. In today's Saturday History video, I'd like to continue to explore past examples of foreign meddling in American elections. Last week we talked about the first, which was in 1796, when Citizen Genet from the French Revolutionary government tried to influence the election in the United States. But this example is several centuries later, in 1940. As World War II started, Britain was increasingly alone in the face of German aggression and Nazi aggression. And after France fell in May and June of 1940, Britain was really freaked and needed the United States to enter the war, or at the very least supply them with war materials so that they could effectively fight against the Germans. Roosevelt decided to run for a third term in the United States, and there was concern that he might be defeated by the isolationists in the Republican Party. The likely Republican nominee was either Tom Dewey, the district attorney in New York, or Arthur Vandenberg, the senator who was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, both of whom were isolationists, both of whom were opposed to getting involved in World War II or helping the British in any significant way. So the British went to work. They opened an office in New York designed to try to promote a candidate who could oppose Vandenberg and take the Republican nomination. And they settled on a Midwestern Indiana utility executive named Wendell Willkie. And they set up Willkie clubs all throughout the United States and primed the Herald Tribune, the leading Republican newspaper in the United States, kind of what the New York Times now is for the Democratic Party. The Tribune back then was for the Republican Party. Its publisher, Ogden Reed, was really the leader of the international wing and the eastern wing of the Republican Party. They plucked Dewey from obscurity. He'd never held public office. He'd never run for public office before, and started a boomlet for his candidacy, funded, strategized, and controlled by Britain, by the British government. There's never been a more overt meddling in an American election. Willkie, as demonstrators chanted, "We want Willkie," at the Republican convention, swept through to the Republican convention, winning a number of primaries on the way, and ultimately got the Republican nomination and ran against FDR for the third term. That contest, because of the British meddling, assured that there would be no isolationist view in the election campaign. And while tens of millions of Americans opposed Roosevelt because of what they thought was his interventionist policy, and turned out to be, there was no expression for that because the British government had hijacked the Republican Party. Willkie lost, Roosevelt won, moved us toward World War II involvement, and then used Willkie as a diplomat from the American government touring the world to help American foreign policy. Thanks for watching. We're seeing a great example of Donald Trump's tough approach to foreign policy in the way he's dealing with Turkey. Turkey, as you know, is a NATO ally, but it's been moving more and more in the direction of an alliance with Russia and China and with the Palestinians against Israel. Anti-Semitism has been rising in the Turkish government, and Erdogan, the Turkish prime minister, has increasingly been acting not as the secular pro-Western leader he was years ago, but as someone who's quite hostile to our interests. In particular, there's a civil war going on between the Turks and the Kurds, and as the Turks become more and more hostile to the United States, the Kurds have been more and more friendly. It was largely Kurdish soldiers that permitted us to rout ISIS and to wipe it off the face of the earth. And the Kurds have always been very cooperative with our military operations, both in Iraq and in Syria. And finally, they're getting some attention in Washington. Most recently, an American pastor, Andrew Brunson, has been languishing in jail in Turkey for more than 2 years on accusations of working with the Kurds. Although what a pastor can do to work with them, other than give spiritual advice, I'm not sure. Trump has demanded his release and demanded that Turkey start acting like a NATO ally. And because it's not, this week he imposed sanctions on Turkey. And the sanctions have had a devastating effect on the Turkish economy. Since the first of the year, the lira, their currency, has dropped by 40% against the dollar, half of that drop coming in the last week. And Erdogan is talking about the U.S. stabbing him in the back, that's his line, and trying to go to Russia and China to bail him out. But they don't have the money or the resources and aren't willing to part with them to do that. Increasingly, Trump is really making Turkey pay for Erdogan's policies. This is just the kind of thing Obama would refuse to do. It's just the kind of thing that led people to believe the United States was weak and led people in countries to try to take advantage of it. But Turkey is learning a lesson. Don't fool with Donald Trump. Thanks for watching. As we go through the summer season, wildfires are breaking out all over the United States, and there's a record amount of acreage being burned up in California in particular as a result of drought conditions. And the left is very quick to say that this is because of climate change, decrease in rainfall, increased warming, and the like. But Secretary of Interior Zinke is pushing back on that. And he says that a huge reason for these fires is environmental law that stops timber companies from logging in these forests. So there's a massive accumulation of underbrush, of dead wood, of dead trees that are sitting there and really are tinder boxes that can go up very easily if any spark sets them off, or lightning sets them off, or a campfire. And that if we permitted logging companies to come into these forests, they could get rid of much of the dead wood, get rid of this, clear this underbrush, and give us healthy, lasting forests that are not burned down by forest fires. It's the ultimate example of overregulation causing a problem rather than solving it. Now, the environmentalists claim that this is just a ruse by the logging companies to try to increase their production of timber. But the fact of the matter is that ever since Bill Clinton, there have been enormous restrictions placed on timber production in the United States. And along with those restrictions, hand in hand, has come a big increase in forest fires and wildfires and acreage destruction. And this correlation cannot and should not be overlooked. Fortunately, President Trump is taking action to address this. The Farm Bill that has passed the House and is now pending in the Senate has a lot of provisions in it to permit timber companies to go in and clean up this underbrush and make these forests more viable and less likely to go up in flames. The Senate has not passed it, and many of the senators are objecting to it, but it's a very important piece of legislation, and I hope it passes. Thanks for watching. Elizabeth Warren, who I'm coming to like less and less, said in a speech the other day that the American judicial system was racist and was dominated by white men who did not really understand the problems of the average person. Well, I looked at some of the stats, and she's just totally wrong. The blacks, African Americans, are 12% of America's population, but they represent 15% of the federal appellate judges, 12% of the federal district court judges, 13% of state and local judges, and 14% of America's police officers. So how is that racist? People who claim that the system is racist usually point to the very high percentage of blacks who are convicted of first-degree murder. Well, we don't know if that's right or wrong, obviously, but we do know that 85% of the dead bodies who are murdered are black or African American. So it's very possible that the statistics that show 70 to 80% of the victims are black is accurate, because the culprits and the victims very often share the same race. This whole concept of racism in the justice system is an absolute fabrication, and it's designed to decrease the opprobrium or the condemnation that comes with being convicted of a serious crime. Part of this decriminalization of crime is in the effort to ban the box. They say the box is the box that's on a form that you fill out when you're applying for a job that says, have you ever been convicted of a crime? And the Equal Opportunity Commission under Obama ruled that it would be illegal to ask people that question. Now increasingly that's being changed by Trump, but it still is ridiculous. Recently I just read that the Board of Elections in New York State, New York City, is actually entering Rikers Island prison to sign inmates up to vote. They've registered 6,000 of the 8,000 people who are currently in jail. This has to end, and the excuse that crime is that enforcement of the law is racist is just wrong. Thank you. As the good economic news pours in, 4.1% growth rate this last quarter, the American people are increasingly absorbing that information and factoring it into their political decision-making. The Rasmussen poll asked people, who do you credit more with the current economic news, the current good economic news, Trump or Obama. And by 50-40, they now say Trump. And when they asked people, do you know someone personally who is out of work now and is looking for a job? Back in December 2011, it was 83%. In November of last year, it was 53%. Now it's down to 46%, the lowest that it's ever been. And when they asked people, this is all Rasmussen, do you think your home is now worth more than you owe on it? It's now an all-time high of confidence about it by 66% of the voters. And when asked, how would you rate Trump's job on the economy, it was 50% positive, and on foreign policy was a 47% positive. And overall, his job rating averages out now at 44% positive, but among likely voters is more likely approaching 50. Very good news, and it couldn't come at a better time as we're headed into the congressional elections. Thanks for watching. All hell is breaking out in Iran. There are massive demonstrations in the street, hundreds of thousands of people in every Iranian city, major demonstrations. People have been killed, and the regime is really facing the most serious challenge it's had in a decade. But this time, the Trump administration is loudly trumpeting, pardon the pun, the idea of regime change and the sanctions. The sanctions against Iran, which were suspended by the ridiculous deal the United States signed, half of them snapped back into place today, the rest on November 4th. The ones for today deal with dollar transactions, many of the banks, many of the industries, the auto industry in Iran, and the ones on November 4th are total sanctions that deal with any trade, any ability to operate a bank or a financial institution, or any dealing in Iranian currency. And while they're imposed only by the United States, you know their impact now is global, because any company that doesn't obey them can't do any business in the United States. Already the rial, the Iranian currency, has fallen to below 50,000 to the dollar. In fact, in some cases, some reports are 100,000 to the dollar. And this is sparking riots all over the country. Renault, the French automaker, which was one of the first in line to get back into Iran in 2013 when this phony nuclear deal was passed, has already announced that it's withdrawing from Iran. It's pulling its facilities out of Iran and looking elsewhere in Africa for investments. And it was the head of Renault, Carlos Ghosn, who said back when the sanctions were imposed, when the market reopens, the fact of having stayed will certainly give us an advantage. But even with that kind of mindset, they're leaving now. And in addition, the French automaker group PSA, Total, the huge oil company, and the reinsurer Score SE have all pulled out of Iran. So the Trump sanctions are really beginning to cut, and the possibility of regime change in Iran certainly can't be discounted right now. Now, this morning, before I did this video, I sat there and I scoured through the New York Times to see any reference, actually I did it last night, any reference to Iran demonstrations, turmoil, and all that. Didn't find any. The Washington Post had an article, but it was largely about sanctions, and it's only the Wall Street Journal that really put it where it is and talked about the issue in stark terms. So the mainstream media, this is a non-happening, but it's happening, and it's another indication of the enormous impact of the sanctions that Trump is levying against both South Korea and Iran. But Iran, having a globally integrated economy, is suffering more. On November 4th, the sanctions come against the Iranian oil industry, which should hit the country like a shockwave. And that's what brought them to the negotiating table in the first place. And now there's no table to go to except for the one where they surrender. Thanks for watching. For today's history video, I'd like to talk about what makes Russia tick. Now that we have removed the veneer, the coating of communist ideology and communist expansionism, what is the underlying cause for Russia acting the way it does, for their autocracy, for their ongoing imperialism? And Henry Kissinger has a fascinating answer. He says that Russia is a country that's composed of almost 200 smaller nations, independent ethnic groups, that would much rather be their own country. Some of them are breakaway republics from the USSR, the Soviet Union, who have declared their independence and are now functioning as separate countries. Some of them are countries within countries and ethnic groups within ethnic groups, not only in the former breakaway republics, but also in Russia itself. And they've never amalgamated. They've never melted. It's never been through a melting pot. They still exist. They're still separate, and most of them still hate each other. And given half a chance, they'll escape. And as a result, the centrifugal tendencies of Russia are so enormous that the only way to keep Russia as a coherent whole is by trying to expand. That if Russia is trying to grow its borders and intimidating ethnic groups and countries on the border, it can intimidate and control the ethnic groups within Russia. That Russia cannot exist in a state of stasis, in a state of stability, because the frothing of the ambitions of its ethnic groups will drive it apart. And it's only by imperialist outreach to extend its borders that Russia can maintain a domestic coherence. And it's a brilliant theory. I think it's quite accurate. And it's because Russia came about not through settlement and colonization like we did in the West, or through choice like we did through immigration, but by conquest. And these folks still don't want to be conquered. And the centrifugal forces are so strong. Then add to that an economy that basically is the same as Saudi Arabia's, where Russia has a tremendous high-tech base and a great capacity in IT and could become an incredible IT superpower if it ever harnessed that. It remains essentially an oil republic, a country dependent on oil and gas exports for almost 2/3 of its exports and about 1/3 of its GDP. So it's in many ways like Saudi Arabia. And that amount of oil, that money that flows in freely from energy from abroad to Russia, now is siphoned into the pockets of a deeply corrupt elite led by Vladimir Putin. What Putin has done in the last 20 years is to take over the oligarchy. And each of these oligarchs who were billionaires and received this oil money come flowing in have now been cut off from the money and then given the money back on condition that they hold it in trust from Vladimir Putin, not institutionally, personally. He uses these oligarchs like savings accounts where he parks his money. And he doesn't himself own the stuff, so it can't be used against him in corruption. They own it, but he has it, and he can use it and buy it and sell it and make a profit from it. That's why the sanctions that Trump is imposing on Russia are so important, because what they do is they tell these oligarchs, this money can be taken away from you. We could sanction you, which means you can't use the money. You can't put it in a bank, you can't wire funds, you can't receive funds, you can't borrow against it, you can't use it as collateral, you can't do anything with it. all you can do is put it under the mattress, because we've cut you off from the global banking system. And this is a threat not to Russian power, but to Vladimir Putin's personal fortune and the money he's parked, stationed with the oligarchs throughout Russia. And the United States is threatening that money in two ways. First, by the sanctions, but also by fracking, by the work in the United States to drill down into slate rock, explode the rock, and then take the oil up as a result. And this has so magnified American oil reserves and is increasing our oil production basically by the rate of about almost 1 million barrels a day. So the United States will very soon, probably this year, eclipse Russia and Saudi Arabia as the #1 oil producer. And the sky's the limit after that. And because of that, the ability to set oil prices and have high prices, which is the key to Putin's continuing to make money, is being eroded by America. So it's really important for us to understand those fundamental points about Russia. And that's why the Trump sanctions that have been imposed on Russia in the wake of its Ukraine invasion and its Crimean invasion and its human rights abuses within Russia are terribly important. And it's why Putin will trade almost anything to try to get rid of them. Thanks for watching. From Michael Cannon, the Cato Institute expert on healthcare, comes enormous news that you won't read about in the mainstream media, but it should be a banner headline. Donald Trump has now replaced Obamacare with a new form of private sector-based insurance that I'm calling Trump Care, and it is absolutely terrific. It permits any individual to be covered, or any group, to be covered for any amount of coverage they want, tailored to their own needs for as long as they want to have it, free from government regulation and coercion. Under Obamacare, you had to buy insurance on everything, all 10 diagnostic categories, and including sex change operations and psychotherapy and substance abuse. And that drove up the cost enormously, so the deductibles and the premiums were impossible. But now you can buy private sector insurance, annual insurance, that covers exactly what you need, tailored to your requests and your needs. And it's guaranteed renewable. It has to be renewed every year for the rest of your life. And premiums cannot be increased based on illness or use of the policy. It stays forever at what are called healthy person rates. And it extends coverage to 2 million people now not being covered. It's really the perfect answer. The way it emerged is brilliant. When Congress refused to kill Obamacare and refused to pass an amendment by Senator Ted Cruz that said that you could have policies that are more narrow in scope than those required by Obamacare, Trump stepped into the breach. And his regulation said that you can offer policies of up to a year that you can always renew that cover whatever you want. Obamacare had authorized such policies for 3 months only and had said they could not be renewable. So Trump reversed the Obamacare regulations and said it could be for a year and it could be renewable if you wanted that, and of course everybody will. So by these executive actions, Trump has literally repealed and replaced Obamacare, one of the long-standing objectives of the Republican Party. Thank goodness for this president. Thanks for watching. A few weeks ago, as I reported in one of these videos, the Supreme Court issued a momentous decision on the issue of voter fraud, saying that it was perfectly legal and not a violation of federal law for states to clean up their voter lists and get rid of people who don't belong on it, who have died or moved away. That process of cleaning the voter lists had been made illegal by the Obama administration under the claim that this was a device to chill voter turnout and that it was a civil rights issue not to do that. So a bunch of states, led by Ohio, had actually implemented a voter reform of cleaning the list proposal. Ohio sent out cards to people, postcards, that were not forwardable, and people had to send them back. And if the person had not voted in like 2 elections and failed to return the card, they would then get a notice that they're about to be dropped from the voter roll, and unless they spoke up, they would be dropped. And that's because there are 3 million people who've died who are still on the voter rolls, and many millions more who've moved away. And in the absence of photo ID, this makes voter fraud really, really possible. So Obama had passed a law saying states could not cleanse their voter rolls in this way. And the Supreme Court overruled it and said you can do that. And now Kentucky has done it, the first state in the nation to act on this. This is revolutionary in its impact, because it really means that voter fraud can be curtailed, can be ended in the United States. So there are 2 ways to do that. One is to have a clean voter roll, the other is to have photo ID. Together they're great, but either one would be very effective. And now Kentucky has required a cleaning of its voter rolls. If this process extends to other states throughout the country, voter fraud, which is a big part of Democratic victories at the polls these days, will be eliminated. Thanks for watching. One of the most fascinating stories about the post-Civil War period in the United States is that a movie, The Birth of a Nation, which came out, a silent film, in 1916, really spawned the recreation of the Ku Klux Klan and was responsible for an entire generation of civil rights abuses against blacks in the South and throughout the rest of the country. The Ku Klux Klan was formed immediately after the Southern defeat in the Civil War in the early 1870s. And the figures in white sheets were supposed to be the ghosts of the Confederate war dead who had come back to haunt the Reconstruction-era South. The federal government, under the U.S. President Grant, strongly opposed the Ku Klux Klan and used its military force in the South to repress it. And the Klan basically went out of existence as the 1870s unfolded. But then it sparked a resurgence in 1916 as a result of the release of a movie called The Birth of a Nation. This movie, which chronicled a northern and a southern family through the Civil War, and was strongly endorsing racism, portrayed blacks as sexually aggressive and ignorant, and led to a focus on how Reconstruction was unfair in the South and had damaged the region. It took a thoroughly Southern point of view of the Civil War and glorified the Ku Klux Klan. In fact, the original name of the movie and the name of the book on which it was based was The Klansman. This revival of the Ku Klux Klan led to a surge of racism throughout the South, major increases in lynchings of blacks. In one year, over 2,000 blacks were lynched in the South. And it became a cultural part of the American South. The damage done by Birth of a Nation was compounded in 1936 when the novel Gone with the Wind came out, and in 1939 when the film based on the novel was released. And like A Birth of a Nation, but more subtly, they depict blacks as favoring slavery, as being coddled by the slave system. They put down Northerners who tried to eliminate slavery, and then missionaries who came to the South to try to help the newly freed blacks. They depict with horror and revolt and anger the destruction of the plantation system and decry the influence of Northern mercantilism and financially based politics and corruption. These two films, Gone with the Wind, Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, both played a huge role in the revival of racism in the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Klan had been abolished, and the South was beginning to adjust to the idea of putting behind it the racism of the Civil War. But these two films brought it to the fore, made it a national cause, and really provided the impetus behind the segregation system that was not dismantled until the 1960s. Rarely have two movies been as destructive of American society. Gone with the Wind, of course, is still idolized and romanticized, and people still read the book. I just finished it a couple of years ago, and go to the movies. Birth of a Nation, which was a silent film, is less popular, although it was revived in 2016, largely as a historical document. But rarely have two movies done more damage than those two. Thanks for watching.